Hi, foster friends. This is Jill with the Foster Life, and I want to talk probably the next few videos about gratitude. And this was sparked because I made a video last night about going to the Empowered to Connect simulcast, and kind of that it brought me back to my teaching years, and it just took me back. Um, and I was talking about my students, and one in particular who was very much my son before I ever had kids, and he was a student in my classroom. And he reached out to me last night after he watched that video. And basically, he's told me what he's told me before, that I was his second mother and that he loves me. And just, that bond is there and that bond can never be broken. And so I was telling my husband today how much that meant to me, that he did that for me. Um, and that he tells me that every chance that he has, he tells me that because he knows how special that is to me. He knows how special he is to me. But I want to talk for a minute about gratitude. And I really think that when someone does something and has a profound impact on your life, you should tell them. Even if it's a small incident, if it's a small impact, a moment where something changed for you and something shifted. And I certainly had those people in my life growing up. So I want to tell you about one of them today. And he was one of my teachers, and his name is Mr. Wagner. And I first met Mr. Wagner because he was my brother's uh, um, music teacher. He taught private lessons to my brother, and then he was my brother's band teacher. And I thought Mr. Wagner was super cool. And so I was so excited. I grew up in a very diverse elementary school in Indianapolis, Indiana, School 98. And when I went to middle school, I went to John Marshall. And everyone from Indianapolis knows John Marshall. You know that John Marshall is not a fun place. You pretty much have to carry yourself in a specific way there so that you are not targeted. And I was afraid to go to John Marshall, but I knew I would have band with Mr. Wagner. And so I loved going to school because of Mr. Wagner's class. He had that much impact on me. And we were probably a couple months into that school year. This is around 1991. And we were just a couple of months into that school year. And I was on the school bus coming home just like any other day. And on the PA system of the bus, there was all of this chaos that came on. And it was screaming and it was crying and it was a sound that I can never unhear. And our bus driver pulled over on the side of the road on 38th Street. We had just passed Post Road, and he just pulled over. And my bus driver was a really strong man, and he's the kind of bus driver you didn't really mess with. You just, yes sir, that's it. You didn't mess with him. He pulled over, and he was listening, and he had the microphone in his hand, and he was trying to talk to them, but he couldn't talk because all this chaos was coming. And I just remember kids just screaming bloody murder, fear and panic, and it was just horrible. And the bus driver looked in his rearview mirror at us, and we were all silent. We were just stunned and silent. And he had these big tears in his eyes, and he said, "I can't go back. We've come too far. I can't go back." Dang, I will never forget that bus driver and that look in his eye. And none of us knew what was going on other than we just heard these screams, and it was the worst thing I'd ever heard. And about 5 minutes later, I get dropped off at my bus stop, and I go home, and my stepdad comes home, and I said, something happened, and I don't know what happened. And I told him about it, and then my mom came home, and I told her about it, and my brother, and I just told him it was awful. It was horrible, and something really bad happened, and that night it was all over the news. And it was one of the first major, probably the first major school shooting in Indianapolis. And there was a little girl that was shot in the head that day on the school bus. And nobody really knew what happened. Didn't really know what happened. And just the news, it was on every news station, everywhere. And so we go to school the next day, police everywhere. And we get to my first period class. It's Mr. Wagner's class. And all the kids are like, what's going on? What's going on? I mean, everybody's talking like, what happened? What happened? And he sits us down and he just starts crying. And he says, I got to talk to you guys. I got to tell you this. I got to tell you what happened yesterday. And he starts to tell us a story about how there was this, he was out for bus duty and all the buses were heading out and they were all leaving. And there were just a couple of buses, and forgive me if I'm not completely accurate with this, but a couple of buses were heading out last, and he heard a shot, several shots. And he said that his instinct was he just took off running. He just took off running toward the bus. And he ran all the way out there. The bus came to a stop, and he got on that bus, his first teacher on that bus, and he said that he just saw blood. I will never forget this story. And he said that the kids were yelling, get down, he's going to get you, he's going to get you. And he said, who's going to get me? And they said, that kid. And he looked over, and there was a Burger King across the street. And there was a kid over there in the bushes. And Mr. Wagner said he looked down at this little girl, and she was sitting there with her hands on each side of the head of this little girl that had been shot in the head. This little girl was just laying on her, and he told her, just keep your hands right there, holding onto the bullet wounds to try to save this little girl's life. And he took off after that kid. And I'm going to tell you something. Mr. Wagner is fearless. He is the most fearless teacher I have ever met. He is the most gentle and kind soul I've ever met. What happened that day was this, and it infuriates me. There was a gang member who was in the bushes, and his rival gang member was getting on that bus. And this idiot kid, instead of, going up to the gang member and dealing with the gang member however he thought fit, though, that's not really even appropriate anyway, he just shot at a bus full of kids. And this little girl got shot in the head. Because of Mr. Wagner's instruction and because of that little girl holding those bullet wounds, that little girl lived. And that story doesn't stop there. I wasn't at John Marshall much longer. And I went from a child who went to school with children of poverty. We were all colors. We were all races. Fairly large Chinese population, definitely African American population, white population, Korean. My first crush was Korean. Frankie's my buddy. He's so cute. But I share that because I want you to understand that going from a school where you're all impoverished, it wasn't about what color we were, okay? Not at all. Nobody had money, and I didn't know it. I didn't know that we didn't have much money until I started my new school. And I started in a school that was just a little bit north of that area, a middle school, very well-known middle school in that area. And it became apparent to me on day 2 that there were haves and there were have-nots at that school. And those kids, some of those kids, not all those kids, don't get me wrong, there were just a couple of them. One bully in particular, the one that sought me out for the next 2 years and made my life a living hell. A boy at my school, actually, made sure I knew I was a have-not. And I went from a child who was a straight A student at John Marshall, had been a really A-B student most of my life, to C's, D's, and an F. And it had nothing to do with how smart I was. It had nothing to do with my academics whatsoever. It was all about the fact that I had no connection there. There were not kids there like me, at least that I knew of. And I had this one bully who was targeting me all the time. I didn't want to go to school in the morning. My stomach hurt. I wanted to throw up. I did not have the clothes like these girls had. I didn't know what Castleton Square Mall was because I had never been there. I knew what the Kmart was down the street. I sure knew what the Goodwill was down the street. That's where I shopped. And so many of these kids were just all about the things of life. And I was not. I never grew up like that. We were about the traditions and the love, and we were about togetherness. I mean, my gosh, I came home from school every day and watched Little House on the Prairie with my family. I hated band. I went from a kid who excelled in band at John Marshall to band teachers that didn't really pay any attention to us. Later, I found out some other stuff that was going on with one of those band teachers in particular, but I hated it. Every day I hated it, and I hated school, and I was so depressed that year. And my dad made me stick with it. He made me stick with band. In my 8th grade year, I was so disgusted about going back to this school. I hated this school. I hated it. I just wanted to go back to John Marshall. Okay, for those of you who know what John Marshall is, I just wanted to go back to John Marshall. That's how bad this was for me. And I walked into that 8th grade year hating myself, hating the people around me. I only had a couple of friends, only a couple really that were good friends to me, that weren't all about things. And when I walked into my 8th grade band class, Mr. Wagner was there. And I cannot tell you how much hope that gave me, that it was going to be all right and I was going to be okay, because he was there. And I've told him how much I appreciate him, but I don't think he really understands what he did for me that year. I had no hope. It was gone. I had this kid targeting me, this boy in my grade targeting me, harassing me daily. I'm going to tell you another story here in a couple of days about that kid. I'm not going to name him. He knows who he is. It was ugly. Bullies. I know now that young man was hurting and that there was something in his life that was bad. I know that now, and I've forgiven him, even though I've never had a conversation with him about it. He knows who he is. But, Mr. Wagner, you have no idea what you did for me. You have no idea the impact that you had in my life. That you took a kid who felt like she had lost all hope, who was dealing with a lot of stuff from my childhood that I needed to kind of deal with, and I had turned into a bitter, angry, the girl that I was the rest of my 7th grade year, you wouldn't have liked, because I became someone that I didn't like. My 8th grade year is when I started to turn it around, and it's because of you. So Rick Wagner, you keep doing your thing. I love you. Carry on, my friends.